Europe has always played a central role in open source, from Linux to MySQL to projects that power today's digital economy. But as the landscape shifts to AI, cloud, and digital sovereignty, the question is whether Europe can turn that heritage into global leadership. To dig into the latest data and what it means for Europe's future, I am joined today by Gabriele Columbro, General Manager of Linux Foundation Europe. Gabriele, welcome back. It's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be here. Nice to see you again, Swapnil.
You have just released fresh data on the state of open source in Europe. Europe has always been a hub of open source innovation, from the kernel to MySQL and so many other technologies. From your perspective, what are the key highlights of this report? What stood out even for you?
Great question. I have to say it's been a data heavy last couple of weeks at the Linux Foundation. To your point, we released the World of Open Source report, but we also released our commercial open source report for the first time in partnership with some European VC. We recently hired a chief economist at the Linux Foundation who has published previously a lot of data from Harvard Business School, Frank Nagel. So it's been a flurry of data that is really being, I think, very helpful, especially I think we hope for communities out there, but also for me as, we shape the direction of Linux Foundation Europe. Back to the report is the third year that we run a regional specific what we call World of Open Source report. This year was titled, based on its conclusions, open source as Europe's strategic advantage. And there are a couple of points that really stood out for me. First and foremost, we continue to see open source as a more and more recognized as a strategic lever for Europe's economy, geopolitical balances. So it's going way beyond technology. If you talk to European experts, it's really it's elevated from a technical consideration to a strategic lever for digital sovereignty. It was one of the main sort of top line, I think, outcomes from the report. That being said, there is a gap. There is a gap between, what's perceived as valuable in open source by sort of the practitioners, those of us, who lived in the bubble, as well as sort of the general technologists, with relatively fewer executives, understanding sort of the strategic values of open source. I think, there was about 20-30% gap. I think 80% of employees would recognize its strategic value, only about 60% of executives. So we think that's certainly a gap to work on. And then, last but not least, I think there are lessons for the open source community itself. There were a lot of feedback that we got both in qualitative and quantitative interviews as to how open source communities should and could better engage with policymakers. We live in the European, sort of in the era of regulated open source. If you think about, especially in Europe, the Cyber Resiliency Act, the AI Act, there continue to be regulations that impact technology and therefore open source, given that open source makes up from 80 to 90% of technology. And so there's certainly a call from the open source community in Europe for stewards and foundations like us to better engage and I would say earlier engage with policymakers in upcoming regulation. And that's something that we're certainly quite focused on as Linux Foundation Europe.
Another theme is the gap between vision and execution. You touched on that as well. Europe has deep grassroots talent. The kernel community is heavily based here. Even Greg KH moved to Europe. But US companies seem to dominate in releasing and commercializing open source. What do you see as the biggest barrier holding back wider adoption right now?
I think that's a super important question. I would slightly rephrase it in the sense, I don't know that it's necessarily just hampering open source adoption, but I do think there's a couple of key barriers, which I also touched in my keynote at Open Source Summit, as to how Europe can leverage strategically open source. Look, in terms of adoption, if you look at surveys, depending on which survey you look at, open source makes up 80 to 95% of every application that is written nowadays. And that is largely, independent of the region. The adoption, so the consumption of open source, the usage of open source, whether it's recognized or not, whether it's acknowledged or not, is there, and it's independent of the region. What I do think, though, going back to this sort of gap, is the recognition of how to effectively leverage open source for strategic purposes. And so when I think about the strategic goals of Europe, whether it be digital sovereignty, whether it be growing its relevance in technology, in what has largely been over the last few years, everyone talks about US and China, and their investment in, especially in the wave of AI. I think Europe has a couple of key sort of barriers. As you say, it's not the lack of talent. It's not the lack of grassroots contributions. But I think if I can pinpoint to two of them, one is the lack of a commercial ecosystem that is scalable and provide incredible alternatives to some of the large commercial open source players that are born out of Europe. I was on a panel about 2 months ago with 3 founders, commercial open source founders. They're all Europeans, but they all then moved to the US in seek of a better funding climate and of a better exit climate. So one of the key outcomes, and this is actually proven in our commercial open source report, but I think the first big point is that there is not enough investment in a commercial ecosystem that ultimately can build products and services in open source. Because if you think about it, that's how consumption of open source happens in the most cases, especially in enterprise context, especially in governmental context. They need someone to support or service the customer, if that makes sense. So I think that's one big point, the lack of funding from a VC or from other sources. The second one is, if you look at the contribution in terms of labor or in terms of financial contribution to open source, it was estimated to be about 7.7 billion globally to open source from the enterprise world. But if you then cross-reference this with, for example, the Open Source Contributor Index, you see that there's no European large organizations in the top 10. I think there's 2 in the top 20 contributors to open source, which goes to the second point, which is that lack of strategic C-suite understanding of open source means that some of the large traditional industries that exist in Europe have not yet invested, again, both in labor, in terms of contributors, or in terms of support financial to maintainers, to foundations, in the same way that you see in other regions. in the US, largely driven by private companies. In China, largely driven by the public sector, if that makes sense. And so I think those two elements makes it so that, yes, there is a amazing grassroots and amazing innovation is produced in Europe, but the value gets then extracted somewhere else. And that creates doesn't allow the virtuous circle to create, especially in the topic, I think, of digital sovereignty.
I mean, I'm talking to you, so I would love to ask this question. If we zoom out, it is kind of striking how innovation has shifted. Historically, most of the technologies product that we use came from Europe. There is printing press, steam engine, car, almost everything. But things change when we talk about IT. Today, most household names come from either US, China, Japan, Korea. Some may argue that it's Europe's regulatory culture that slows things down. Others may point to things like funding gaps, fragmented
Yep.
market, or risk averse attitude. Why
Yep.
do you think we haven't seen a Tesla or AWS or ChatGPT emerging from Europe?
Look, I think you touch on a couple of important points. I think the fundamental question is, should Europe look to create new hyperscalers and copy this model? Or, to your point, the European market is fundamentally different and Europe should embrace that. If you think about in terms of GDP, Europe is still, the largest GDP if you compare, the different, the 27 EU Eurozone states. And Europe has a large, vibrant SMB, small and medium business environment, many of them also based on open source. So I think that rather than trying to copy the existing models, Europe should embrace its difference. And yes, I think something, we're not a lobbying organization, we're not a policy organization, so I'm not going to venture into political recommendations or statements here. But there certainly is, to my previous point, a less appealing and attractive regulatory and fiscal climate for great innovators and founders. And Linus, the internet was created in Europe. We still have, amazing founders, Salvatore Sanfilippo from Redis. We had Daniel Stenberg, the creator of Curl, speaking at the event. So, it's not that we don't have the talent. It's about surely creating, while privacy respecting, while, fostering digital sovereignty, but creating that fiscal and funding climate to ensure that that talent continues to develop in Europe, creating successful venture, which then reinvest in open source and creates this virtuous circle rather than talent, creating in Europe and then escaping to another region, understandably seeking the biggest exit. So I think there is absolutely something to be done in finding a better balance between regulation and fostering the economic development of a commercial open source ecosystem. And I think the other point being, again, it doesn't have to necessarily be large hyperscalers. To your point, Europe has a very different culture, very different requirements. It's perfectly understandable and probably preferred that you have local partners that know how to serve, a specific culture, a specific language, a specific regulatory requirement. Because let's not forget, sure, the EU has EU level rules, but there are obviously much stronger laws at state level. If you say compare with the US model, it's more, of course, more distributed. These are nation state clear example, national security. The EU doesn't have a national security mandate, while the US federal government does. And so it's much easier to have centralized policies when it comes to, supply chain security and so on and so forth. Now, we are seeing efforts in that space. The EU Sovereign Tech Fund that got recently announced is a good example of trying to level up a nation level German sovereign tech fund to an EU level effort, and I certainly welcome more of these efforts. But I think, again, it's important to understand that maybe Europe shouldn't look about necessarily copying and having sort of this hyperscaler model while having strong enough, competitive enough national level alternatives that can serve their own markets. And that's, I think, the crux of digital sovereignty, if that makes sense.
The fact is that it goes beyond politics. Having digital sovereignty is really important for a lot of countries, a lot of regions. Can you talk about how do you see open source is shaping digital sovereignty, not just for Europe, but for the globe? So
Yep.
countries are not overly dependent on one region for their critical IT systems.
Great question. And frankly, it's one of the key themes that we are developing at LF Europe. One that I thoroughly spoke in Amsterdam 2 weeks ago, and that I will continue to cover across the events that we have in Brussels in mid-October, and you'll see us being more active in this space. So there are two parts to your questions. One is how do you see open source being strategic? And second one, how should Europe specifically look at that in the scope of digital sovereignty? The first answer is, if you are an enterprise, absolutely, and I've learned this through my experience at Finos, with the largest bank in the world, which, as you can imagine, are the most ROI-driven organizations out there. It is about the value, the commercial value that you're going to get out of open source in the way you run your business. Is it a cost reduction? Is it a competitive advantage? Is it a commoditization of a certain competitor that, through open source, you are able to make a market or disrupt a market? And so I think those are some of the drivers that when I talk to enterprises across the world, and particularly in Europe, I'm trying to bring some of the experience that I've developed both working with banks on the East Coast and living in California now for 10 years as to how the large technology companies think strategically about open source. Again, I'm thinking, as a case in point, Anthropic is not a open source company per se, but they have open source MCP about 2 months ago, and since then it has gone viral. It has become the framework of choice that is fueling this agentic era of AI that we are in. If you are a public sector, then I think digital sovereignty is absolutely the most important reason why a nation state should look at open source as a way, to your point, to reduce dependencies on non-local, on foreign service providers. And look, there's a reason, don't get me wrong, why there are multiple reasons why the hyperscalers got to where they are. It's not just the scale, it's not just the capabilities, it's also being able to service their customers very well. In the US, they've got this down to a science. Again, the SaaS world that I live in has all practices that are very, very, again, structured and successful. So when I think, this goes back to the point that I was trying to make before, it has been clearly recognized. If you hear about initiative like IPSIS or Eurostack or plenty of initiatives out there. Even in the recent State of the Union from Ursula von der Leyen, you've heard a call to prefer European technologies as a fundamental pillar of sovereignty, of national security. That's absolutely understandable. How does open source play into it? To me, is a nuanced question. Some folks out there are suggesting, that there should be European open source versus US open source versus China open source. I think that is a very short-sighted view, as it would break this beautiful digital commons. If you think about open sources, one of the few remaining avenues for us to collaborate globally, and its exponential growth is largely due to the whole world contributing to the same commons, and those 7.7 billion that we see even from enterprises every year being poured in open source. So it's not about fragmenting open source, but it's about understanding that building on the global commons, you can create a very lively commercial ecosystem in Europe, going back to those points of funding, better fund exit climate, and enterprise contribution back to open source. I think if we address those 3 points, Europe could create the new Red Hat, or the new Confluent, or the new Databricks, based on a global open source project, but with the company actually being based in Europe, and therefore fostering its own, charting its own future, its own national security.
Do you see open source as a way to broaden global innovation rather than fragment it?
I often refer as open source as a positive sum game. This is frankly how I have been able to grow Finos to over 100 members, some of the most conservative industries of the world. You can imagine you cannot start with open source for public good with those people. I certainly come personally from a grassroots movement and grassroots idea of open source. But when you then have to convince and sell at strategic level, at C-level, why would you share your intellectual property? Why would you contribute upstream? Why would you fund a maintainer when that is free? It's important to recognize that open source is a positive sum game. And by positive sum game, I mean a game where not necessarily one person wins and the other person loses. It's a win-win. The very nature of open source means that you can absolutely, whether you are an individual or a corporation or a government, you can absolutely participate to open source and contribute to open source to drive your own selfish goals. So in a way, it's selfish altruism. But the byproduct is, to your point, that there is a global digital commons that is built out there that anyone can build upon, whether it be advancing the technology or whether it be building commercial businesses over that piece of technology. And so I think that is sort of the crux, that as long as we keep open source global and we don't start fragmenting it, sort of falling into the trap of balkanization, of the nationalization of open source, keep open source global, but drive your own goals and your own values, whether, again, you are a bank or a tech companies or Italy, drive your own goals through open source. And that is going to, not only recruit a lot more people that likely are aligned in terms of those goals, but also, to your point, allow you not to reinvent the wheel if you are a consumer. I mean, think about the AI race. Europe wants to play an important role in the AI race. What are you going to do? You're going to restart by writing Kubernetes and rewriting Linux? Well, you're never going to catch up if that's your approach.
You mentioned AI and agents earlier. Beyond sovereignty, how do you see open source is helping Europe stay competitive in areas like AI, cloud, or cybersecurity, where global players are already so dominant?
Well, frankly, to be blunt, I frankly believe open source is the only way Europe can gain competitiveness in the AI space and in the broader technology space. By building on the existing building blocks, growing its influence on those by sweat equity, so direct contribution, and of course, funding. And based on that, being able to create, again, this commercial ecosystem that it's local, that it's vibrant, that is lively, and that delivers to those goals of digital sovereignty. I go back to some of these initiatives out there that are pushing for digital sovereignty. They talk about buy European, and that's perfectly fine to buy European, as long as that European software is open, it's based on open source and it's based on global open source. If you are going to, again, reinvent the wheel, that's not going to get any better any soon in terms of sort of the geopolitical technology balance. And I think we're seeing the signs actually not just in Europe. 1 year ago, we were all talking about large language models as the sort of race and competitive differentiator. It's become pretty clear now the large language models will be commoditized. Since DeepSeek and the DeepSeek moment, every large organization has open sourced their models. Even OpenAI open source their GPT-5 base model. So the competition is no longer going to be on the models. Can argue whether it's going to be on the agents and what's built on top of these models. But my point here is that as large language models are commoditized, basically DeepSeek showed us that open source brings back the competitiveness, the race to ingenuity, to scarcity. DeepSeek came out of, scarcity compared to the sort of Silicon Valley, CSP, GPU heavy sort of capital investments. And so I think that's the model that Europe should really embrace. Base yourself on open source, base yourself on global open source, and put the resources where it matters to grow this ecosystem and grow your, technology autonomy.
Let's talk about community. We all know and love that Europe has a long tradition of great open source projects. Python, MySQL, Linux kernel, Arduino, Raspberry Pi, the list is long. But when we look at European enterprises and governments, are they doing enough to build and sustain communities around these open source projects? Or is the focus still too much on regulation and compliance?
I think there's still, again, depending on which survey you look at, but there's still more, open source developers and contributors out of Europe than I think China is second and US is third. So from an individual perspective, from a, personal perspective, as a European, I think we are more inherently driven to share and to work in open source. I think a recent report from a European VC, Red River West, talks about 1.6 more developers in Europe than in the US. But also talks to 4x less funding. So if you think about 55% of the open source companies were created by Europeans, but 80% of the exits happened in the US. And so I go back to, are we doing enough as Europeans? Well, I think as individuals, absolutely. Are VCs doing enough? No, but they're gearing up. And I think there is a huge opportunity there. Are enterprises doing enough? Well, we see some bright spots. The financial services foundation that I lead. We have LF Energy with all the energy companies. We have Margo with a lot of manufacturing companies. So we're starting to see, I think, the traditional industries that undergo digital transformation realizing more and more the value, the strategic value of open source. But there's way more to go, as you don't see, you only see 2 European companies in the top 20 contributors out there. And from a government standpoint, look, the EU has done a lot of investment in open source, programs like Horizon, NGI, even a nation state level, there's been a lot of funding ongoing. But it's almost like quite fragmented. There hasn't been a unified strategy. And I think as we enter, the multi-year budget planning, you'll see some of this hopefully consolidation happen. The EU Sovereign Tech Fund being a good example of a proposal that goes in that direction. But also there hasn't been this sort of follow through. I think it's important, given the, I think, outsized role of the public sector, both as a regulator and as a buyer in Europe, compared to, say, the US market. It's important to recognize that we need public-private partnerships where maybe the EU seed funds some of these open source projects, but they have to then be sustained by private investments that creates sort of the flywheel that we so much talked about during this interview.
Before we wrap this up, I would like to hear, what is one trend in European open source that business leaders should be paying closer attention to right now? Something that could give them signals on where to invest and how to move forward.
I mean, since I would have said digital sovereignty, but since we talked extensively about it, I think that sort of goes without saying. I think the rise, the role that open source will play in agentic AI, it's probably the most exciting and I would say groundbreaking development that we are seeing now in open source. The Linux Foundation recently announced A2A, the agent protocol contributed by Google, moving to the Linux Foundation. And so I think if I was talking to a C-level, whether it be in the technology side or on the business side, after DeepSeek, everyone talks about AI and have a slightly understanding of how open source is going to play a key role in AI in the future. I would say look further, because we are seeing open source being at the core of the agentic AI revolution, and it's time to engage right now. Otherwise, you'll risk not only vendor lock-in, but simply to stay behind. And we're seeing a lot of unsuccessful right now. If you look at certain health reports out there, deployments of AI in traditional industries, I think open source gives a chance to really sort of raise the success ratio of projects that enterprises are developing to become AI ready.
Gabriele, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. This conversation shows just how much is at stake, from digital sovereignty to competitiveness and community, and how open source can be both Europe's strength and a global connector. Thank you for sharing your insights, and I look forward to chat with you again. Thank you. And back to our audience, if your company is working through these same challenges, we would love to hear your story. So please don't hesitate and reach out to us. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and stay tuned for more conversations here on TFR. See you next time.